Yeah. Into the ether. Reminder, of course, that after hours tomorrow we have special guests on the 14th. Today is the 13th of February. Today's little project is on Paul Cockshott on value. Cockshott is a Scottish academic in computer science and Marxist economics, reader at the University of Glasgow, proponent of a moneyless socialist economy based on cybernetics and direct democracy. Cockshott advocates for a system of moneyless economy based on a computerized planned economy and direct democracy. He's criticized the economic calculation problem on the grounds that planning can be made feasible via computerization and allocation based on labor time. I've included today a three-part thing that Cockshott did on new socialism. Not going to play that now. What I will show is his video on why the labor theory of value is right. It's an interesting spin on the idea, and you know it has a certain uniqueness to it. Um,
Sorry, I'm late.
Been almost universally accepted in the early 19th century. The leading economists all believed in it. But by the mid-century, it was being criticized in establishment circles because it was seen as politically
uh, damn it. Let's try this again.
Is it muted?
Mm, no. Oh, yes, you're right. Thank you very much. Such an idiot. We'll try this again. Maybe I can't do it in full screen too.
It's like once you're drawing now. The cursor's a pen.
I know. I'm
Um,
trying to. Oh, there we go. God damn it. There we go.
one of the things that Engels emphasizes is that socialism can only succeed politically and economically if it's based on some sound scientific theory. And this applies not just to our understanding of present society, but also to an understanding of the laws which will govern any future society. And it was this conviction that led Marx to devote so many years of his life to uncovering what he called the laws of motion of capitalism. He wanted to show what the underlying basis was for the class division of society. And on this basis he wanted to show the limitations of reforms that didn't change the fundamental structure of the society. And in all this, the key to his analysis was the labour theory of value, something which had been developed by previous political economists, but which he brought to its final development. A rough outline of my talk is as follows. I will be talking first about what the labour theory of value is, why it's important to understanding exploitation, how it has been attacked both from the standpoint of the subjective theory of value and from the standpoint of what's been called the transformation problem, what the evidence is for the correctness of the labour theory of value. I'll be looking at what the causal mechanisms behind it are, and possibly answering some new objections to it. What does it say then? At its simplest, it says that the average price of a good will be proportional to the average labour used to make it. And if you look at a whole industry, the value added in an industry will be roughly proportional to the labour that the industry uses. Price quantities, therefore, are seen as the indirect representation of underlying quantities of human time. This is the basic insight of the labour theory of value from Adam Smith onwards. The theory was developed by Adam Smith in the late 1700s, further refined by the English economist David Ricardo in the 1800s, and by the 1820s the theory was being used by a number of socialists like Thompson and Gray to argue that since labour was a source of value, profits and rent must be nothing other than exploitation. These critiques were further refined and popularised by a German émigré, Dr. Marx, who was living in London in the 1860s, and it's through his version of it that the theory has come down to the present. It had been almost universally accepted in the early 19th century. The leading economists all believed in it. But by the mid-century it was being criticised in establishment circles because it was seen as politically risky. And then by the late 19th century only socialists still supported it, whereas most orthodox economists had moved to alternative theories from marginalism or subjectivism. And these alternatives remain the orthodoxy that is taught to students in economics to this day. Let's look at some of the lines of attack that conservative economists have used. On the one hand, they've said that prices in the end represent subjective valuations of commodities. On the other hand, when they present a more elaborate theory, they say that where you get a price, it's where you get the intersection between what are termed a supply and a demand curve. Now, in another publication, I go into some detail as to why this doesn't constitute a scientific theory. Basically, it's a matter of Occam's razor, which says you shouldn't multiply entities beyond causes. At any one time, all you can observe is a combination of a certain quantity of goods being sold and their price. And you can observe this different quantities being sold on different days. If you're going to explain that in terms of two curves, you are inventing more unknown entities than there are observables, because a curve even in its simplest form of a straight line, requires at least two constants to define it. If it's not a straight line but has some degree of curvature, you'll require 3, 4, many constants to define it. These being the parameters of a polynomial. Now, if you have a series of made up or unknown constants, and there are more unknown constants than observables, then you have a theory which is unfalsifiable, because you can always make up combinations of these constants which will explain the observations. So you, as a basic principle in a scientific theory, you can't have more unknowns in your model than there are data points. And the entire supply and demand model demands that you have more unknowns than data points. So it can explain everything and can never be falsified. The next basis has been to critique the labour theory of value as being inconsistent based on what is called the transformation problem. And this at least has the virtue of being in some way tied to what some of the writers on the labour theory of value have themselves said, both Ricardo and Marx. And this has been the basis that was pushed by the orthodox economist Samuelson, a guy whose textbook was the most widely used introductory economics book in the US. Now, any scientific theory has to be one that makes predictions that can be put to observational test. That's something I was saying in the case of supply and demand theory. It's untestable. If it makes no predictions, it's meaningless. And if it cannot be tested, it's not scientific. If it is testable, and if its predictions are borne out by observation, then the theory should be accepted. Now, how does this apply to the labour theory of value? How would we set about testing it? To verify it, you need information on the money value of the output of lots of industries, and you need information on the labour content of the outputs of these industries. If the money value is closely correlated with the labour content, then the predictions of the labour theory of value have been confirmed. If, on the other hand, they were uncorrelated, then the labour theory of value would clearly be falsified. How do you get this information? Well, you couldn't have done it 100 years ago. But you can do it nowadays, since all countries publish what are called input-output tables for their economies. I'm going to show you a sample input-output table, explain how it works, and then I'll explain how the tests have been done. Okay, this is a view of the United Kingdom input-output table. In such a table, you have a set of headings down the left, which say what all the industries are. And these are repeated along the top. And then you have a set of cells within the table, which tell you how much of the outputs of one industry are used in another. So if we take agriculture, forestry and fishing, we can see that agriculture, foresting and fishing was 2,283 million pounds worth of it were used by the agriculture, forestry and fishing industry. Another 6 million pounds worth of the output of agriculture, hunting, forestry and fishing was used in the mining and quarrying industry. If we look along a bit, we can see that food production used about 10 billion pounds worth of output of agriculture. Textiles used 31 billion pounds worth. The wood industry used 214 million pounds worth, etc. So if you look on the left hand side here, you have the industries, and as you go across each row, you see, you see how much of that industry's output was used by each of the other industries. And then right down at the bottom, we see how much labor was used in that industry, and then we see what the output of that industry was in money terms. Given the table, and given a computer program that will read it and process it, you can work out how much labor was used directly and indirectly to produce the output of each industry. So if you're trying to work out how much labor was used to produce the output of the mining industry, you include the direct labor used at the bottom of the row, and then you see how much labor was used indirectly in each of the other industries that it used products from. And it doesn't take very long to calculate this. When you've done that, you get figures for the amount of labor that was used by each industry, and you have figures for the actual price for which that industry's output was sold. Now, I have graphed the data from the UK industry there, and I have made available to people a program which will work from such input-output tables to give the results I've used here, so you can test it yourself if you wish. And the thing to notice about this is that the data roughly lies on a straight line, which is what you'd expect. If it's the case that the number of person years determines the value of the output, then you'd expect a complete straight line here. Now the data is very close to a straight line. There is some jiggering and jaggering about, but basically it's a straight line, which is what the labour theory of value predicts. There are just a couple of extreme outliers here, and those turn out to be the oil and oil refining industries, the value whose output is rather higher than you would predict by their labour content. But these are what the classical economists call natural monopolies, and the Ricardian theory of rent says that industries which have natural monopolies and depend on the ownership of land, in this case, or in the British case, the ownership of the seabed, can be expected to sell their output at a price that's above their labour value, or above their average labour value. They're governed by what's termed the marginal labour value. So the results shown here are entirely conformant with what Ricardo's labour theory of value predicted. If we go on to some other countries, we can look at here are the countries. These are the years the studies were done in. This is the number of industries, and this is the degree of correlation between the labour content and the value of industrial output, or sectorial industrial output. And it's extraordinary how strong the correlation is. 98.6% for Japan, 97% for the USA. The UK has somewhat lower results than the other ones. That was the UK data I was giving you, 95.5. So the UK data I gave you was unusually poor. Most countries, the correlation is much stronger. It's as close as, damn it, to a straight line.
Well, and there you have it. That's for those who came in late. Paul Cockshut is teaches at Glasgow, and I included a couple of videos of not only his views on a variety of things, which are actually kind of interesting, including on Maoism, for example, on Mao on contradiction as well, and a three-part thing on what a new socialism might look like, which are always interesting. It is from the point of view that scientifically you could have a, a proper distribution of everything by going to a kind of full-scale scientific a computerized sort of modeling. Um, and the point, of course, is being made in the video about whether Marx does or doesn't have a labor theory of value. Now, the point that he's making in this is, you know, thoroughly answered by previous generations of economists in the affirmative. It would seem unnecessary to even examine the issue. But David Harvey has recently posted a short article claiming that Marx was an opponent of the labor theory, and that's problematic in and of itself. It's widely believed that Marx adapted the labor theory of value from Ricardo as a founding concept for his studies of capital accumulation. Since the labor theory of value has been generally discredited, it is then often authoritatively stated that Marx's theories are worthless, but nowhere, in fact, did Marx declare his allegiance to the labor theory of value. So that's another way of thinking about Marx and labor theory of value. That theory belonged to Ricardo, who recognized that it was deeply problematic, even as he insisted that the question of value was critical to the study of political economy. On the few occasions where Marx comments directly on this matter, he refers to value theory and not to the labor theory of value. So this is, it's not that hard to parse. So what then was Marx's distinctive value theory, and how does it differ from the labor theory of value? So the point being, of course, that remember that Marx is making a critique of classical political economists, his fellow classical political economists, if you will, and that's kind of important to consider. But as Cockshut says, it's difficult to take this seriously, but as Mike Roberts has done a reply, I probably should do likewise and type a brief response. So the last couple of days, been thinking about some of these matters and comparing a variety of approaches. You will recall a couple of days ago that we're looking at responses by Michael Roberts, among other folks, to David Harvey, among others, and that it was sort of an interesting set of interactions and questions, including Carcetti, et cetera. Harvey claims that the labor theory of value is generally discredited, but in what sense? It's correct to say that the theory is not viewed with favor in economics departments, but that is for political reasons. The labor theory of value came, since Gray and Marx, came to be associated with socialism. And since academic economists in general did not want to be tainted with the socialist label, and yes, that still does exist, they were at pains to distance themselves from the theory, but none of them ever adduced any empirical evidence to refute it. It was socially discredited, but not empirically refuted. Now, if one wants to refute a theory about the world, you have to show that the theory makes incorrect empirical predictions. Eratosthenes refuted the theory that the Earth was flat and confirmed the theory that it's round by observing that when the sun was overhead and it was at an angle of 7 degrees 12 minutes to the vertical in Alexandria, implying that the Earth was curved with a circumference of 25,000 miles. If the Earth had been flat, the angle of the sun would not have varied as you went north. Something you should ask all those flat earthers about. The labor theory of value predicts that the price of commodities will vary proportionately with their labor content. Refuting this should be easy. Just show, in fact, that their prices do not vary with labor content in this way. Did the economists opposed to the labor theory of value do this? Did they? Hell, did they not even bother to collect the data to do the test? So for a century after Marx, the theory was, quote unquote, discredited, but never empirically refuted. As soon as economists started to collect data to test the theory, which depended on reasonably good economic statistics of whole economies, what did they find? They found that Ricardo and Marx had been right all along. A whole bunch of studies since the 1980s have shown that the labor theory of value is pretty good at predicting prices, which you saw in the video. Far from being refuted by the evidence, it has been confirmed. David Harvey is like a flat earther after Eratosthenes, denying the earth is round on theological grounds. David Harvey, next complains that Marx nowhere declares his allegiance to the labor theory of value. True enough, since at the time Marx was writing, this was the only theory going. It simply was the theory of value, big V. It was only afterwards that the alternative marginal utility or neoclassical theory of value was established. After Jevons, economists distinguish between the classical or labor theory of value and the neoclassical or marginalist theory of value. But it's ridiculous to expect Marx to have taken sides in a debate that only started after Capital was published. At the time he was writing, it was widely accepted to accept that, labor was the source of value. Even Jevons, the founder of marginalism, still accepted that prices were proportional to labor, thinking that his marginal utility theory gave further support to this time-honored assumption. Now, Harvey promises to explain what Marx's theory of value actually is, but nowhere in his article does he do this. That is because it would be impossible to do this without revealing that the theory of value in Marx is identical in all major predictions to that of Ricardo. So, that's a kind of theoretical question that you can ask. Well, what exactly did Ricardo's theory say? Did Marx agree with him? And as I've tried to point out before, Marx does agree in many ways, but complains, and rightly so, that Ricardo was too linear. He assumed certain things that don't quite apply in reality. When comparing theorists, especially ones who originally wrote in distinct languages, you should not pay too much attention to the precise vocabulary that they use. What is important is the relations between the concepts they deploy and the relationships that the theorists predict will hold in the real world. When you look at this, you'll see that Marx followed Ricardo's value theory very closely. There are four key components to their value theory on which both authors, Ricardo and Marx, agree. Number one, the exchangeable value of commodities varies with their direct labor content. Number two, the indirect labor used to make raw materials and equipment also contribute proportionately to the exchange value. Number three, it is the labor actually expended, not the level of pay of the workers, that determines value. And number four, the variation of price with labor will be modified by the formation of an equal rate of profit on stock. Now, the theories are therefore substantially identical in the empirical predictions they make, differing only slightly in terminology. Points 1, 2, and 3 are validated by the empirical data in the studies cited earlier. Point 4 is poorly supported or refuted by the empirical data. Marx and Ricardo say the same thing when they're both right and say the same thing when they're both wrong. So yes, Marx has a labor theory of value as Ricardo had. The greater part of this theory is not refuted by the evidence, it is confirmed by it. Now, this does not mean that Marx made no contributions. Major innovations in Marxist thought were the point that labor only gets represented as exchange value in societies that have private ownership and atomized production. Marx says exchange was absent in traditional Indian communities or the communism of the Incas. the prior economists had assumed that all societies produce commodities. Secondly, the distinction between labor and labor power. Thirdly, the introduction of the concept of surplus value is something functionally prior to the division of surplus value between profit, interest, and rent. Number four, a new theory to explain the falling rate of profit. Number five, a repudiation of Say's law. Number six, the concept of absolute ground rent. The introduction of more modes of production than the ones Adam Smith recognized. And finally, the idea that the class struggle leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. These are all significant innovations that did distinguish him from his predecessors. There is no need to pretend innovation by Marx in value theory, a topic where he rigorously used Ricardo's concepts. But what about, the concept of abstract or concrete labor? Was this distinction not an innovation on Marx's part? Well, the specific phrase concrete labor was different, but the relevant conceptual distinction between the two was present in Adam Smith's work. Smith simply uses the term labor unqualified, where Marx sometimes says abstract labor. Smith specifically says that when he's talking of labor in this way, he's talking of labor in the abstract. When Smith discusses the division of labor, he's discussing the division of the abstract labor into what he terms varieties of labor or sorts of labor. This is the same distinction that Marx is making when, using the slightly different term, he talks of abstracting from concrete labors or kinds of labor. So in tabular form, this is the difference between Adam Smith and Karl Marx. In variety kind, palpable, kind, and concrete labors. And then there's abstract labor or labor, abstract and abstract labor. The same conceptual distinction is being made here between the different kinds of activities into which the labor is divided, and labor in the abstract or the abstract notion of labor. And we've covered that before. And there's a reasonable set of things that you might read for additional consultation. Now, the thing that I read the other day that was that I read from the printed text is actually in video form by Koshot, which you put up a couple of weeks ago. And it was essentially discussing, a sort of academic kerfuffle, I suppose. And another article that has a more conceptual element to it, and he claims that it's a long post. It's not really that long, and so we'll be able to finish with this. Marx's Law of Value, a debate between David Harvey and Michael Roberts, as we've read Roberts before, and his fairly recent postings. This is Kochot's response. This is going to be a long post, so bear with me. First, you'll have to read a paper attached below by Professor David Harvey, then a critique by me below, and then finally a reply to my critique by Professor Harvey. So you have kind of the nice interchange that Harvey's response. And then it's up to you, readers, to see what you make of it. It's like a medieval religious debate about how many angels there are in the head of a pin, or is it a debate that leads to something really worth knowing? And David Harvey's misunderstanding of Marx's Law of Value, Michael Roberts. Recently, Professor David Harvey sent out an email to several people, including me, attaching a short paper for discussion. There's a link to the Harvey paper. The paper outlines David Harvey's view that Marxist theory of value in capitalist economies has been badly misunderstood. Just in case you're unaware, and difficult to believe, Professor Harvey is probably the most eminent Marxist scholar alive today, with a host of books, papers, educational videos to his name on Marxist economic theory. The short paper circulated expressed succinctly his view of Marx's value theory that is recently outlined more expansively in his latest book, Marx, Capital, and the Madness of Economic Reason. This is a slightly older article. In the paper entitled Marx's Refusal of the Labor Theory of Value, David Harvey argues that Marx did not have a labor theory of value at all. His theory of value was distinctive from that of the classical economist David Ricardo. Instead, according to David Harvey, Marx argued that the value was a reflection of labor embodied in a commodity which is only created or revealed in exchange in the market. As David Harvey puts it, if there is no market, there is no value. Now, if this is correct, then it is in the realization of value as expressed in money that value emerges, not in the production process as such. And this is, seems subtle difference, but it's actually kind of important, particularly when other people are talking about this. David Harvey then goes on to argue that if wages are forced down to the minimum or even to nothing, then there will be no market for commodities and thus no value. This is the real root of capitalist crises, and it thus follows that a policy for capital to avoid crises would be by raising wages to ensure rational consumption from the standpoint of capital and colonizing everyday life as a field for consumerism. This is the consequence of a correct view of Marx's value theory, according to David Harvey. David Harvey points out that this interpretation of value theory is far beyond what Ricardo had in mind and equally far away from that conception of value usually attributed to Marx. It certainly is. But is David Harvey right in his interpretation of Marx's value theory? And even if he is, does such interpretation have any empirical validity? Now, I would answer both of these questions with no, none, nine. Use Marx's three best known languages. Cockshot is not without humor. David Harvey starts by saying it's widely believed that Marx adapted the labor theory of value from Ricardo as a founding concept for his studies of capital accumulation. And since the labor theory of value has been generally discredited, it is then often authoritatively stated that Marx's theories were worthless. It's not clear who David Harvey is referring to here. Clearly, bourgeois mainstream economists consider Marx's law of value as discredited. The neoclassical marginalists have long rejected the concept of labor value by labeling it metaphysical. Neo-Ricardian, post-Sraffian, and post-Keynesian economists in particular are also strongly inclined to dismiss any notion of value as an ideological mystification, and this is fairly consistent through the literature for a variety of reasons. I mean, you could see that the Red Scare made people, speaking of value means, is an ideological mystification. And it still may be for those of you with that particular taste. But most Marxist economists are aware of the distinction between Marx's value theory and Ricardo's. And the difference is not what David Harvey says it is. Namely, Ricardo had a labor theory of value and Marx did not. The difference is that Ricardo had a theory of use value based on concrete labor, that is, physical amounts of actual labor measured in labor time. Now, where Marx goes away from this is Marx's law of value was based on abstract labor. This is why commodity is the first chapter in Marx's Capital. Abstract labor, that is, value measured in labor time when socially tested on the market. This is that whole issue of labor power that we've talked about. Under capitalism, human labor power itself is a commodity to be sold on the market. Indeed, this is a key characteristic of the capitalist mode of production, where the majority has no means of production and thus must sell their labor power to the owners of the means of production. So, just as with other commodities, labor has a dual property. On the one hand, it's useful labor, that is, expenditure of human labor in a concrete form and for a specific purpose, and with this property creates use value. On the other hand, aside from four fingers and a thumb, it is abstract labor, that is, expenditure of human labor power without specific characteristics which creates the value of the commodity in which it is represented. Thus, Marx made the distinction between labor and labor power, a distinction that is absolutely crucial for the understanding of the source of profit. It is why, commodity leads the book. It could have done it a bunch of different ways, but commodity helps to move it into this idea of abstract labor. This was a great advance in Marx's law of value. the labor time embodied in the commodities normally purchased by the worker for the reproduction of himself and his family in a day is less than the labor time that a worker actually offers to the owner of capital during the same time period. The result is that for any given time period, the worker produces more value than the wage equivalent, which is paid by the owner of capital for the use of the labor power. This difference Marx calls unpaid labor. So there's paid and unpaid labor, and surplus labor, or surplus value. Marx's value theory of abstract labor exposes the exploitative nature of the capitalist mode of production, while neither Ricardo's nor Adam Smith's labor theory of value does. David Harvey mentions just once, and in passing, this vital discovery of Marx, i.e., abstract labor, that distinguishes Marx's law from the classical labor theory of value. And that's because Harvey wishes to press on to his interpretation of Marx's theory as one where value is created / realized only in exchange and not in the process of production using labor power. This is Department 1 versus Department 2. David Harvey says that, quote, value is initially taken to be a reflection of the social or abstract labor congealed in commodities, unquote. But as a regulatory norm in the marketplace, value can exist, Marx shows, only when and where commodity exchange has become a normal social act. So without money, there is no value. Now, the reverse, that is, without value, there is no money, is a more problematic proposition. Yes, but the value of a commodity is still the labor contained in it and expanded during the production process before it gets to market. Value is expended physical and mental human labor, which is then abstracted by the social process of production for the market. Value is not a creature of money. On the contrary, money is the representation or exchange value of labor expended, not vice versa. I think Marx is clear on this crucial point. He says in Capital Volume 1, quote, the value of a commodity is expressed in its price before it enters into circulation. Department 1 versus Department 2. And it is therefore a precondition of circulation, not its result. Murray Smith, in his new and forthcoming edition of his book Invisible Leviathan, provides a concise explanation of the difference between Marx's law of value and David Harvey's interpretation. Marx said that money as the measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value, which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. Smith comments that this is certainly inconsistent with the idea that value can be created in the act of exchange. It is precisely because exchange affects a process of equalization of products of labor on the market, that is, involves a real abstraction, that production oriented towards exchange must take account of the fact that physiological labor is both utility shaping and value creating, that is, both concrete and abstract at one and the same time. Now, to try and argue that value is created not in production, but at the articulation of production and circulation is a notion replete with circular reasoning and requiring the most robust of mental gymnastics to entertain. The problem with this approach is that if one accepts that abstract associated labor has no substantial existence apart from the value form, money, then commodity values appear to be severed entirely from any determination of the conditions of their production, and the way is paved for an effective identification of value and price. Instead, Marx's law of value is based on the view that labor involved in the production of commodities produces value, while exchange realizes it in money form. It is only because of this that Marx can distinguish between the amounts of value and surplus value created in commodity production and the generally different amounts realized through exchange. Contrary to the view of the mainstream and neo-Ricardian economists, there is no mystification here. Value is objective and real, and not just expressed in money. Marx's law of value, where abstract labor, measured in labor time, explains exchange value and prices, abstract labor can be empirically validated. There is reason behind Harvey's interpretation. If value is created only at the moment of exchange for money and money rules, then it will be effective demand that will decide whether capitalism smoothly accumulates without recurring crises. To show this, David Harvey describes in some detail the impact of capitalist accumulation on the conditions and living standards as capitalists strive to raise relative surplus value through the introduction of machinery. He uses some of the graphic examples provided Marx in chapter 25 of volume 1. David Harvey emphasizes that capitalist accumulation aims to minimize the value of labor power, even to the point of pauperism. David Harvey concludes that, quote, if this is a typical outcome of the operation of the capitalist law of value accumulation, then there is a deep contradiction between deteriorating conditions of social reproduction and capital's need to perpetually expand the market. As Marx notes in volume 2 of Capital, the real root of capital's crises lies in the suppression of wages and the reduction of the mass of the population to the status of penniless paupers. So the real root of crises is found in the suppression of wages, see minimum wage, and the reduction of the mass of population to the status of penniless paupers. The rich get richer. This is an underconsumptionist theory of crises. Now, there are several points here. First, Chapter 25, entitled The General Law of Capitalist Accumulation, does not just refer to the pauperization of the working class. Harvey leaves out a very important aspect of that general law, that is the tendency for the organic composition of capital to rise. This is what drives up relative surplus value, but is also a key factor in the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is developed in volume 3 of Capital. The most important law of political economy, which lays the basis for Marx's theory of crises. Now, David Harvey ignores this aspect. He does, clearly, and in his companion to Capital, he sort of sidesteps it in a weird way. But David Harvey goes further in his underconsumptionist interpretation. Value depends on the existence of wants, needs, and desires, backed by an ability to pay in a population of consumers. It also means that the diminution of wages to almost nothing will be counterproductive to the realization of value and surplus value in the market. Raising wages to ensure rational consumption from the standpoint of capital and colonizing everyday life as a field for consumerism are crucial for the value theory, unquote. Thus, David Harvey, argues that capitalism goes into crises because wages are suppressed, and so raising wages, ensuring rational consumption, would provide the ability to pay, and so end the crisis. This underconsumptionist is opposed to overproduction, and there are these two varieties of interpreting crisis theory. The underconsumptionist interpretation of Marx's crisis theory has been firmly dismissed by Marx himself in the famous note in the same volume 2 that David Harvey refers to. And that's this note. It is sheer tautology to say that crises are caused by the scarcity of effective consumption. That commodities are unsaleable means that no effective purchasers have been found for them. Now, but if one were to attempt to give this tautology the semblance of a more profound justification by saying that the working class receives too small a proportion of its own product and the evil would be remedied as soon as it receives a larger share of it and its wages increase in consequence, one could only remark that crises are always prepared by precisely a period in which wages rise generally and the working class actually gets a larger share of that part of the annual product which is intended for consumption. From the point of view of these advocates of sound and simple common sense, such a period would rather remove the crisis. In my view, that is Kochschadt's view, Marx rejected both the law of value, as David Harvey interprets it, and also the conclusion that crises caused by an inability to pay for the wants, needs, and desires of people. But Marx could be wrong, and David Harvey right on the cause of crises. Empirical evidence does not support David Harvey, however. Let me cite just 3 facts. The first is that workers' consumption is not the largest sector of demand in a capitalist economy. It is productive capital consumption. Gross domestic product or expenditure is a measure of annual demand for needs, wants, and desires. In the United States, consumption would seem to constitute 70% of GDP. However, if you look at gross product, which includes all the intermediate value-added products not counted in gross domestic product, then consumption is only 36% of the total product. The rest constitutes demand from capital for parts, materials, intermediate goods, and services. It is investment by capitalists that is the swing factor and driver of demand, not consumption by workers. So this is that contrast that we see in terms of emphasizing, as in recent years, on financialization. This is shown in the second fact. If we analyze the changes in investment and consumption prior to each recession or slump in the post-war U.S. economy, we find that consumption demand has played little or no leading role in provoking a slump. In the 6 recessions since 1953, personal consumption fell less than GDP or investment on every occasion and does not fall at all in 1980 to 82. Investment fell by 8 to 30% on each occasion, on every occasion. Percentage change in U.S. real personal consumption, investment, and GDP is a graph here that actually shows that. The third fact relates directly to wages and David Harvey's claim that raising them would help capital. Now, Guillermo Carcetti finds that of the 12 post-World War II crises, 11 have been preceded by rising wages and only 1 by falling wages, the 1991 crisis. That confirms Marx's view in the note in Volume 2 above. I conclude from David Harvey's short paper that he aims to establish an argument that class struggle is no longer centered or decided between labor and capital at the point of production of surplus value. Instead, in modern capitalism, it is to be found in other places in his circuit of capital that he presents in his latest book and in various presentations globally. For David Harvey, it is in the point of realization, i.e. over rents, mortgages, price gouging by pharma firms, etc., or in distribution over taxes, public services, etc., that the hotspots of class struggle are now centered. And you can see that currently. The class struggle in production is now less important, even non-existent. In my view, to support this, David Harvey presents a series of theoretical confusions in this paper. First, Marx did not have a labor theory of value. Second, value is only created in exchange in realization. Third, the rate of profit, or even profit alone, is irrelevant to crises. What matters is the driving down of the value of labor power to the minimum or even zero, so that workers are unable to meet their wants, desires, the fear of AI. This becomes a crude underconsumption theory, cruder than Keynes. David Harvey deliberately ignores the difference in duality between concrete and abstract labor and its counterpart, use value and exchange value. The dual nature of value in a commodity, as Marx discovered, is reduced by Harvey to the lack of ability of workers to buy their use values. Use value, that is, wants and desires, is the key, not exchange value in value for David Harvey. Marx's theory of crisis, based on insufficient surplus value, is replaced with insufficient use values for workers as consumers. Overaccumulation is replaced by underconsumption. The class struggle becomes not workers versus capitalists, but consumers versus capitalists, or taxpayers versus governments, and that's kind of where we are. It is not Marx's view. More important, the whole approach is confusing to a class analysis and strategy for the working class struggle. And now here is David Harvey's response to my critique of his paper on Marx's value theory. This is Harvey talking about Michael Roberts. There are obviously some serious points for discussion over Marx's value theory. And I hope that some dialogue with Michael Roberts can help clarify them. Before getting to them, I need to remove a number of misreadings and misrepresentations of my position in Roberts' response. Let me be clear. Value is always created in the act of production, but it is realized in the moment of market exchange. I therefore think of value in terms of what Marx calls the, quote, contradictory unity of production and realization, unquote. Value cannot be produced through market exchange, but it cannot be realized outside of market exchange. Marx is clear enough about that. That's an important point. The essence of value is abstract labor, as I prefer to refer to it, socially necessary labor time, SNLT. Roberts is obviously correct to say that Marx's definition is entirely different from the concrete labor time that Ricardo postulated. No matter whether we say abstract labor or socially necessary, however, the onus then falls on how the abstraction is made and how socially necessary is to be understood. The answer to such questions has to be grounded in material processes and not constructed through idealist exercises. So by what materialist process is value constructed if it is not immanent in commodities but historically created? One could argue that it is both. The answer is given in Marx's starting point in Capital, which is the idealized material act of commodity exchange. If the capitalist takes a commodity to market and there is no want, need, or desire for it, then the labor congealed in it is socially unnecessary and therefore has no value. And this is what Marx says at the end of the first section of Capital in the Penguin Vintage Edition. This does not mean that value is created in the market, which Roberts incorrectly accuses me of saying. But, and here this may be my peculiar way of looking at it, I take the value created in production to be only a potential value until it is realized. An alternative way would be to say that the value is produced, but then the value is lost if there's no demand for it in the market. In which case, we would need to construct a strong theory of devaluation to account for what happens in the marketplace. Devaluation rarely appears in Roberts' accounts and has no role in his response. Given my interest in the relation between value and not value or anti-value, this latter formation might also work for me. But in either case, I think it's undeniable that the state of wants, needs, and desires, backed by ability to pay, has a more important role to play in sustaining the circulation of capital. This does not mean, as Roberts again and again infers, that this is the only relevant factor in crisis formation. I have gone out of the way many times to say that this is just one important moment in the circulation of capital, where devaluations sometimes, but not always, of crisis proportions can occur. But again and again, Roberts loves to relegate me into that pejorative category of underconsumptionist whenever I mention such matters. It was Marx, not me, who said the real root of crises lies in the diminished purchasing power of the working classes. And if I cite Marx on that point, it is because it's a neat antidote to all those who endlessly cite the falling rate of profit. Crises come in many shapes and forms, I've argued. The falling rate of profit or the collapse of consumer demand are two of the many other explanations. I note in passing that Marx, in his comments on the crises of 1847 and 1857, crises that had an uncanny resemblance to 2007, 2008, described the crises as commercial and financial crises without any mention of either falling profit rates or insufficient consumer demand. My objection to any exclusionary productivist interpretation, to cite a matching pejorative characterization, is that it casts to one side the whole history of creation of wants, needs, and desires, let alone the mechanics of ensuring an ability to pay in the history of capitalist accumulation. I think we should pay much more attention to this aspect of things. This does not mean I downplay, deny, or refute all the work that's been done on the labor process and the importance of the class struggles that have occurred and continue to occur in this sphere of production. But these struggles have to be put in relation to struggles over realization, distribution, i.e., or for example, rental extractions, debt foreclosures, social reproduction, the management of the metabolic relation to nature, and the free gifts of culture and nature. These have all figured large in recent anti-capitalist movements, and I insist that we take them all seriously, along with the traditional focus on the Marxist left favoring class struggle at the point of production as the key moment for struggle. That is why I think that the diagram I offered, that is David Harvey, of circulation and the definition of capital as value in motion is so important. Strange to have it all dismissed in the citation from Murray Smith as circular reasoning. This perspective opens up some interesting lines of inquiry and points of difference. Marx's account over struggles over the working day and the forces that drive technological and organizational changes in the search for relative surplus value all depend on the coercive laws of competition. That term comes up at various key points in Marx's argument through Capital. Where is this force mobilized and most clearly felt? In the market, of course. We cannot understand what goes on in the realm of production or social reproduction, for that matter, without market forces playing their part. It's the coercive laws of competition in the market that mandate capitalist reinvestment and the lengthening of the working day, etc. But this tracks back to how Marx sets up the abstraction of value, which, by the way, is in Marx's view, a social relation, hence immaterial but objective, and not immanent and real, as the quote from Murray Smith proposes. Not an atom of matter enters into the objectivity of commodities, says Marx in Capital. Value arises not as a product of thought, but as a product of a historical material process. Marx's study of equivalent and relative forms of value leads into the generalization of exchange, which underpins the rise of value as a regulatory norm operating in the market. And it is this regulatory norm of value that then returns to dominate behaviors not only in the market, but also in the realm of production and social reproduction. This is a very dialectical move that Marx made, but quite commonly encountered in Marx's work. Only in this way, for example, can we understand how it is that workers make the capital, which then returns to dominate them, and how we all become prisoners of our own products. Academics, beware. And there's 2 paragraphs left, and we go. Finally, let me comment on the empirical example on which Roberts reduces final exam from 30 to 70%. To be sure, there's a complicated question on how to deal with value relations across commodity chains. There is an interesting piece by Sarosta on commodity chains and Marx's value theory in an antipode for 2011. But imagine a situation where iron ore is mined and the mining company produces value and surplus value that is realized through a sale to a company that produces steel, which realizes more value and surplus value through a sale to an auto company that produces yet more value and surplus value that is realized by a sale of autos to final consumers who want and need an auto and have the money to buy one. The value of the auto is all the accumulated past labor, abstract labor applied. Now, suppose for some reason the final consumers cannot pay or get fed up with autos. Then all the accumulated value is lost or devalued. In practice, as Marx observed, the chain of payments might take a while to work through, but when it does, then all value production in the chain disappears. Now, of course, all sorts of other scenarios can be imagined, but the point here is that no one apart from crazy people and speculators will want to accumulate steel in the absence of a market for it. So what happens to value in all this becomes problematic, and Roberts' account makes it all seem if investment in the production of means of production is independent of final demand and can occur without any mind for final market conditions, tariffs. Of course, there are certain kinds of investments with all sorts of time lags, that is, fixed capital and infrastructures, like the Chinese overproduction of cities funded by doubling down on indebtedness, where things get very complicated, that is, ghost cities. But Roberts' empirical example makes no sense to me whatsoever as an elucidation as to why realization and the politics of realization are irrelevant, or at best a sidebar to the main action at the point of production. All this, and we have yet to get to the thorny questions of money and the politics of distribution, along with the circulation of interest-bearing capital in relation to value theory. Can banks produce value? Are they clearly producing representations of value hand over fist? Or are they a mere sidebar too? So anyway, there's certainly other things to cogitate on. Michael Roberts, Buckshot, and David Harvey. But in my little brain, this is a significant and important struggle, and other theories come to the fore. I would assert that asking a social ontology question is a means by which you get closer to the value question of what counts as abstract labor. A social ontology, I would assert, has materiality and uh, uh, does help to represent the idea of abstract labor. In fact, you wanted to recode abstract labor as social ontology, you could. Now, there's a whole other set of things you got to do when you do that. That is, have a decent theory of social capital, complete with a network theory. But I think all that's sort of moving along, and as people like these three guys sort of continue to do this, and you need to have all three guys because, in some ways, the discourse over the problem of exchange, of demand, and of course, use are all kind of mishmashed in there. All right, so that's the end of my yammering. Sorry, I went over a little bit over time. Um, uh, yes, thanks to Kelly. I'm glad that people are still having BDS meetings. Um, let's see what else. Cool subtitles. Those are Russian. Yes, unfortunately, they're in the video itself, and you can't eradicate them, so to speak. Um, okay, that's my look at the chat, and I've gone over my time. Let me stop share and kill the